Hey everyone, my name is Scott Miller and I am the Research and Evaluation Director here at P4H Global. And as you may have noticed over the last few months, we recently launched a blog called Redefining Aid. And we hope that this can be a place where we can spark discussion about aid and development and poverty alleviation around the world in hopes that we can all start to think about these issues and rethink what it means to approach alleviating poverty and try to think about how we can best go about this. And so for this week's post, I wrote a blog piece called Malthusian Poverty. And now a lot of people are familiar with Thomas Malthus and his book that was actually published in the 1790s called An Essay on the Principle of Population. And the reason why this book is still talked about today is because over 200 years ago, Thomas Malthus predicted that the world's population would soon grow at such a fast rate that there wouldn't be enough food and resources in the world to sustain that many human beings. And fortunately, what we've learned over the last 200 years is that, well, Thomas Malthus was wrong. And actually, he was quite wrong. Over the last 200 years, the world has grown and expanded, and the standard of living has skyrocketed. So we often look back and we ridicule Thomas Malthus's prediction, for being pretty inaccurate. But at the time, if we keep a few important things in mind, you actually come to realize that, well, his prediction wasn't all that ridiculous. And that's because at the time, in the 1790s, Thomas Malthus was witnessing essentially the largest population growth rate in all of human history. The population growth rate was skyrocketing at the time in a way that the world had never seen before. And at the same time, up until in the 1800s, when we had the Industrial Revolution, the standard of living and productivity throughout the world went essentially unchanged. I mean, people living in the 1700s were only marginally better off than people that were living 1,000 years before that. So what Thomas Malthus was doing was essentially just looking at the trends of history and extending them outward. He saw a really high population growth rate and not all that many resources to support more human beings. So it was pretty natural to come to the conclusion that, well, if things continue in this direction, things are going to get bad pretty soon. And the reason that Thomas Malthus missed this is because he missed one important component, and that is the brilliance and inventiveness of human beings and the ability that we have to solve incredible problems when we're faced with necessity and urgency. And that's an important lesson that we've learned over the last 200 years is just how capable human beings are of solving problems when they really need to. But the reason that I decided to write this piece is because that lesson that we learned with Thomas Malthus, we often forget when we think about poverty. And actually, the way that we think about poverty today is not all that different than how Thomas Malthus thought about the world 200 years ago. We look at countries and places around the world like Haiti and Nicaragua and countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and we see an alarming population growth rate. And over the course of those countries' history, there's been very little productivity and economic growth. So it's very natural for us to look forward and say, well, it's not going to be long before things get really bad in these countries. But the truth is we're making the same mistake that Thomas Malthus made 2 centuries ago, in that we often forget when we look at developing countries. We often forget just how brilliant and inventive the people living in those countries are, and that when these countries rise out of poverty, it's going to be because of the brilliance of the people that live in those countries. And they are just so capable of solving the problems that are laid out before them. And that's a piece that we still tend to forget. And I hope that when you read this blog post, we start to rethink how we think about these countries living in poverty and keep in mind just how capable the people living in those countries are of solving their own problems. I hope you enjoy the piece, and I hope it makes you think about poverty a little differently. Thank you.